He said it the way people say things they've rehearsed so many times they forget it's still cruel. People like you spend your whole career making sure people like him get the credit. He gestured at my brother-in-law when he said it, and the table laughed, not uncomfortable laughter. Real, easy laughter. The kind that tells you everyone already agreed before the joke was made. My name is Lena. And that night at my parents' anniversary dinner, I finally stopped being quiet about what I'd spent 6 years being quiet about. The drive to Millbrook takes 40 minutes from the city. Longer when the November fog settles low over the highway and every exit looks the same. I'd made that drive dozens of times, knew exactly which mile marker meant I was getting close, knew which gas station on Route 9 my mother always wanted me to stop at so she could have a reason to call and check if I'd left yet. Some things don't change, no matter how old you get or how far you go. I pulled into my parents' driveway just after 6, and the house looked the same as it always did for a gathering. Every window lit, cars lining the curb, the smell of something slow-cooked reaching me before I even opened the car door. It was their 35th anniversary. My mother had wanted a dinner, not a party, she'd said. But my mother's version of a dinner seats 14 and involves 3 days of preparation. My sister Renee had organized most of it. Centerpieces, place cards, a slideshow on the living room TV cycling through photographs from 35 years. She was good at things like that, always had been. When we were growing up, Renee was the one who made things beautiful. I was the one who made sure they worked. Inside, the house hummed with that particular warmth that only exists when a family that doesn't see each other often pretends, convincingly for a few hours, that everything is fine. My aunt was already there, my father's 2 brothers, cousins. I only see at weddings and funerals, and apparently anniversaries. Renee floated through the living room in a green dress, her hair perfect, her laugh timed like a metronome. Her husband Brett stood near the fireplace with a glass of wine and the posture of a man who had recently been told again how impressive he was. Brett was a hospital administrator. He managed the budget and operations of a regional medical center, which is a real and genuinely difficult job. I want to be clear about that. I'm not saying he didn't work hard. I'm saying that he spoke about it the way some people speak about surviving war, with a kind of gravity that suggested the rest of us couldn't possibly comprehend the weight he carried. He had a story for every situation, and every story ended with him in the center of it, making the call no one else was willing to make. I took the open seat at the far end of the table, the one near the kitchen door where you can hear everything but people mostly forget. You're there. That's always been my seat. Not assigned, not chosen, just understood, the way a lot of things in our family were understood without being said. Dinner started well enough. My father made a toast that was genuinely sweet, the kind that reminded you why you drove 40 minutes in the fog. My mother cried a little, blotted her eyes with her napkin, squeezed his hand. The slideshow kept cycling. Someone pointed out a photo from 1994, where my father had a mustache he would spend the next 15 minutes pretending not to be embarrassed about. Then Brett started talking about the Callaway regional crisis. It had been all over the local news about 8 months ago. A cyberattack had hit the hospital's administrative network, locking staff out of patient records, billing systems, scheduling, everything. The attack had come in on a Friday afternoon, and by Saturday morning, the emergency department was running on paper. It lasted 4 days before full systems were restored. Brett had given an interview to the local paper describing the ordeal, and my mother had printed it out and kept it on the refrigerator for weeks. He told the story the way he always told it. Slowly, with pauses for effect, watching who was listening. My uncle leaned forward. My cousin's wife set her fork down. Renee rested her chin in her hand with the practiced admiration of someone who had heard this story many times and performed interest anyway. Brett described the phone calls, the decisions, the press statement he drafted himself at 2 a.m, the moment he decided to bring in outside help, despite pressure from the board to handle it internally. He made it sound like a battle. Every administrative decision recounted with the language of combat. I picked up my water glass and let the cold settle into my palm. I knew that story. I knew it from a different angle. 8 months ago, on a Friday at 3:47 in the afternoon, I had received a Priority 1 ticket from Callaway Regional Medical Center. I was the senior incident responder assigned to the case through the firm I worked for. I was the one who got on the phone with their IT director that evening. I was the one who spent the next 96 hours leading the containment, mapping the intrusion vector, isolating the compromised nodes, coordinating with the FBI's cyber division, and writing the remediation protocol that eventually got their systems back online. My team and I had worked in rotating 8-hour shifts, eating vending machine food in a hotel conference room 6 blocks from the hospital, sending status updates at 6 a.m. and 6 p.m. every day until it was done. Brett had been on 3 of those calls, mostly to ask how long it would take. He didn't know my name. I'd been introduced as the lead from the response firm. He'd addressed most of his questions to my male colleague, Miles, even when it was my screen on the shared display and my voice providing the answers. I set my glass down and kept listening. The story shifted toward the part I was waiting for, the part where Brett explained how the attack had been stopped. He said the key decision had been isolating the billing system on day 2, which bought them time to restore patient records without losing financial data. He described it as his call, made after consulting with the response team. He described it as gutsy given the financial exposure. The table murmured, impressed. That isolation call had been mine. I'd presented it to him on a whiteboard with 2 columns of risk. He had approved it because I told him it was the right move and explained in terms a non-technical executive could follow exactly why. Without that explanation, he would have chosen the other column. I had watched him read my whiteboard and slowly understand, like watching someone learn to walk on ice. He didn't say any of that part. The story kept going, and I kept sitting with it, the way you sit with something uncomfortable at a table where the discomfort is not welcome. My brother-in-law had a way of populating his stories only with himself, the way some people edit photographs, cropping out everyone around them until it looks like they were always alone in the frame. Then, someone asked about my work. One of my cousins, trying to be polite, asked what I was up to these days. Before I could answer, Renee said, "Oh, Lena's in tech. She does, cyber stuff." She said it with the gentle dismissiveness you'd use to describe a hobby someone had in college. She laughed a little and added, "Honestly, I still don't totally understand what you do." My aunt asked if it was stressful. My mother said I worked long hours. Brett smiled and offered generously that support roles in cybersecurity were important, that the firms doing incident response were really there to support the organizations doing the real work. He looked at me when he said it. Not unkindly, the way you look at someone when you're complimenting them from a height. I nodded and took a sip of water. My father changed the subject to football, and the table followed gratefully. I had spent 6 years building a career that most people in this room didn't have a framework for, which meant they filled the blank with whatever made sense to them. I wasn't a doctor or a lawyer or a teacher. I didn't have a job they could explain at a dinner party in a single sentence. So, I became the vague one, the tech one, the support one. Renee was the beautiful, organized one. Brett was the hospital man, the decision maker, the one whose name was in the local paper. And I was the one near the kitchen door at the end of the table. That was the architecture our family had built, carefully over years, without ever discussing it. You don't discuss the architecture, you just live inside it until one day the ceiling feels very low. Brett came back to the hospital story over dessert. He did this with his best stories, circled back to them with new details the way you return to a song you love. This time he added something he hadn't mentioned before. He said the real turning point had been when he personally ordered the IT team to shut down the external VPN connections, cutting off the attacker's access point. I looked up from my pie. The VPN shutdown had been my recommendation, delivered in a written brief at 11:14 p.m. on Friday night. I had written the exact sequence: isolate external connections first, then internal segments, then restore in reverse order. The IT director had forwarded my brief to Brett, who had responded at 11:52 p.m. with a single line, "Do it." That was not ordering, that was approving. And it was approving a plan he didn't write, from a brief he didn't author, recommended by someone whose name he had not retained. He said, "I personally ordered and the table absorbed it as fact." My aunt said he must have been under enormous pressure. My cousin said it sounded like a military operation. Renee leaned over and touched his hand. Brett shrugged with the particular modesty of someone who enjoys being pressed to accept credit. Then he turned to me again, not to include me. "To make a point?" He said that what most people didn't understand about crisis response was that the operators in the field, the consultants, the responders, the quote support side, they were good at following a plan, executing steps, but the real leadership happened at the organizational level. The people who had to answer to the board, to the patients, to the press. That was where the actual decisions got made, the decisions that carried weight, that had consequences if they went wrong. He said it pleasantly. He smiled when he said it. My mother nodded slowly. My father said something non-committal. And my cousin's husband, who I had just met tonight and whose name I had already forgotten, said, yeah, someone's got to be in the weeds so the real leaders can focus on the big picture. I put my fork down, not loudly. Just down. 6 years. 231 incidents across healthcare, finance, utilities, and government. 14 ransomware cases. 3 nation-state attribution events. A breach involving a water treatment facility in a county of 200,000 people, where the window between detection and potential contamination had been 11 minutes. I had been on the phone during all of it, making calls, writing briefs, translating technical reality into language that executives could use to make decisions. And sitting here at this table, I had apparently spent that time in the weeds so the real leaders could focus. I thought about that water treatment facility, about the 11 minutes, about the call I had made to escalate directly to the FBI field office because the local IT team didn't have the clearance to handle what we were looking at, about the report I'd submitted that was later used in a federal indictment that had never been in any newspaper. No one at this table would ever know about it, including the person currently explaining leadership to me. Renee, sensing something, tried to redirect. She asked if anyone wanted more coffee and started to stand. But Brett was already leaning forward, warming to his subject, and he added one more thing. He said that during the Callaway crisis, the response team had actually missed something important on day 1, a second access point the attacker had opened as a backup, and it had been his instinct, catching something in the briefing that didn't add up, that had prompted them to look again. That was the detail that unlocked something in my chest. There had been a second access point. It had been identified on day 1 at 6:22 p.m. by me. I had flagged it in the first written status update I sent at 6:mean and confirmed it in the call at 6:30. The IT director had mentioned it to Brett at some point during day 2. Somewhere between my 6:22 p.m. finding and Brett's day 2 briefing, the discovery had become his instinct. My palms were flat on the table now. I was very calm. This was the kind of calm that has a floor under it. Renee finally said, looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, that she guessed I were in the room for some of that, weren't I? Some of it, yes. Brett laughed, generous. He said I had been on the calls, sure, that the response firm had been helpful. Helpful was the word he used. My Aunt Desperate of the hospital had given him any kind of recognition for handling it so well. He said there was a board commendation, yes, but that he didn't do it for recognition, and I heard myself say quietly, clearly, that I didn't either. The table registered the shift before anyone could name it. My father looked at me. Renee's hands stopped moving toward the coffee pot. Brett smiled at me with patient condescension and asked what I meant. I said I meant I hadn't done it for recognition either, which was fortunate, since the people doing the actual technical work rarely received any. He set his wine glass down. His smile stayed, but it was working harder now. He said he was sure the team had been very skilled, that he had nothing but respect for the support side. I said I appreciated that, and then I said the second access point was identified at 6:22 p.m. on day 1, confirmed in writing in the first status report I filed at 6 p.m., and included in the remediation brief I submitted at 11:14 p.m. Friday night with my name on the header. The brief his IT director had forwarded to him at 11:19. The one he had responded to at 11:52 with the single word approved. The table went very still. I said the VPN isolation sequence had been my recommendation, written in section 3 of that brief. The billing system separation had been my call, presented to him on a whiteboard with a risk comparison on Saturday morning, which he had approved after I explained it to him twice. And the second access point had not surfaced from his instinct during a briefing on day 2. It had surfaced from my analysis on day 1, 14 hours earlier, and had been sitting in his inbox since 6 p.m. Friday. Brett's jaw tightened. He said that wasn't quite how he remembered it. I said I had documentation. Time-stamped. ticketing system records, email threads, the original brief with my name in the header, and the incident report I had filed with my firm afterward, which was a standard deliverable, which meant it existed in a format that could be verified. He looked at me the way people look when they realize the floor has changed under them and they don't know when it happened. Renee said my name. Just my name, not a sentence. Just the word, like a hand on my shoulder. I looked at her and I wasn't angry. That was the truest part of the whole thing. I wasn't performing calm, I wasn't suppressing fury. I was just finally saying what was accurate. What had always been accurate. In this house, in this family, for longer than the Callaway incident, the habit had been to make space for whoever took up the most room. And I had always been willing to take up very little. That had felt like patience for a long time. Sitting here tonight, watching my brother-in-law add my work to his story one detail at a time, I understood that it hadn't been patience. It had been absence, and absence doesn't protect you. It just makes it easier for other people to fill in the space with whatever they need. My mother said carefully that she didn't think Brett had meant any harm. I said I didn't think he had either. I said that was almost the more interesting part. Brett was quiet for a moment. Then something shifted in him, not dramatically, not the way it happens in movies, but the way it happens in real life, which is slower and less complete. He put his wine glass down and he looked at me and he asked, genuinely, if he had gotten it wrong. I said yes. I said it simply, not to wound him. Because he had asked. He was quiet again. My father's chair creaked. Outside, a car passed on the street. Brett said he had not realized. He said, and I believed him when he said it, that during the crisis he had been so overwhelmed by the pressure on his end, the board calls, the media calls, the liability concerns, that he had absorbed the briefings as things that were happening and had not retained clearly enough who had made them happen. That was the most honest thing I'd ever heard him say. I said I understood that. I said incident response was designed to be invisible when it worked, that the point was for the organization to come out intact with their story intact, and that his story was legitimate. He had managed extraordinary external pressure for 4 days. That was real. But it wasn't the same as the technical work. And the technical work wasn't support. It was the reason his story existed at all. He nodded slowly, not cheerfully. The way you nod when something is settling into place and it doesn't feel entirely comfortable. Renee was looking at me differently now. Not with the glazed half attention she usually offered when the subject was my work, but with something more focused, a little uncertain, like she was revising something she hadn't known she'd already decided. My mother said quietly that she hadn't understood what I did. She said she supposed she'd never really asked. She said it to the table as much as to me, which was its own kind of honesty. I said it was a hard field to explain at dinner. She said she'd like to try sometime. My father said he'd always known I was doing something important. In that way, fathers say things they mean but haven't said enough. I looked at him and I believed him, and it landed the way things land when they come too late, but are still true. The table found its way back to itself slowly. My aunt asked about the coffee again. My cousin showed everyone a photo of his daughter's Halloween costume on his phone. The slideshow on the TV cycled to a photograph from my parents' 10th anniversary, a restaurant somewhere, both of them laughing at something outside the frame. Brett didn't tell any more stories that night. When I helped clear the plates, he was in the kitchen, and for a moment we were the only two people there. He said without preamble that he owed me an apology. He said it plainly, standing next to the sink, holding a stack of dessert plates. He said he didn't know how to make it right exactly, but that he knew he'd been telling a version of things that wasn't fair and he was going to have to sit with that. I said I appreciated him saying so. He asked if there was anything he could do. I thought about it. I said the next time he spoke about Callaway, he could say that the response firm's lead analyst had driven the technical strategy. He didn't have to name me. He just had to acknowledge that the strategy had existed and had come from somewhere other than his instinct. He said he could do that. I believed him. Not completely. Not in the way that means I'd check or follow up, but in the way that means a person who has just seen something clearly tends to remember it, at least for a while. I left around 9:30. My mother walked me to the door and held onto my arm for a moment before I went out, the way she does when she wants to say something and hasn't worked out what it is yet. She told me to drive safe. She told me she was proud of me. She said it like she meant it. And also like she knew she hadn't said it enough and wasn't sure how to account for the gap. I told her the dinner was beautiful. It was. 35 years is a real thing. The house, the warmth, the slideshow, my father's mustache joke, that was all real and it mattered. Outside, the fog had thickened over the road and the drive back to the city was quiet, just taillights ahead and the hum of the engine. I didn't feel victorious. That's the truest way I can put it. I felt like something that had been held at a particular angle for a long time had been set down, finally at rest. Not resolved, not fixed, just set down. My phone buzzed on the passenger seat. A message from my supervisor. New intake. Priority 2. Financial sector, could I take it first thing Monday? I wrote back that I could. The fob broke somewhere past the county line and the highway opened up. Lights and distance and the ordinary dark of November. I turned up the radio. I drove. I had never needed them to understand the work. I had only ever needed to stop pretending, for their comfort, that the work was something smaller than it was. There's a difference between humility and disappearing. I had spent a long time mistaking one for the other. I didn't make that mistake again. I thought a lot about why it took me so long to say anything. Not just that night, not just about Brett and the Callaway story, but in general. The years of sitting at the end of the table, the years of letting she does like cyber stuff stand in for the real answer. I used to tell myself it was humility, that people who do serious work don't need to announce it. And there's truth in that, I still believe it. But humility and silence are not the same thing, and I spent a long time using one as cover for the other. What Brett did wasn't malicious. That's the part I kept coming back to on the drive home. He hadn't sat down that night intending to take credit for my work. He had simply told a story the way it lived in his memory, and in his memory, he was the center of it. That's not unique to him. That's a very human thing to do. We absorb the outcomes of decisions and, over time, if we're not careful, we start to feel like we made them. Especially when no one corrects us. Especially when the person who actually made them keeps sitting quietly at the end of the table. That's the part I had to own. Absence is a choice too. Every time I let a vague description of my work go unchallenged, I was making a choice. Every time I smiled and changed the subject when someone talked over me, I was making a choice. I was choosing comfort, theirs and mine, over accuracy. And accuracy matters, not because I needed the credit, but because when you consistently let a false version of yourself exist, people start making decisions based on that version. They start designing a world where you fit smaller than you are, and eventually you start living inside their design without noticing when it stopped being temporary. The moment I spoke at that table, something shifted that I don't think will shift back. Not because Brett is suddenly a changed man, or because my mother now fully understands what incident response means. Those things take time if they happen at all. But I said something true in a room where the truth had been quietly managed for years, and I said it without cruelty, without anger, without needing anyone to collapse so I could stand up. That matters. The way you hold yourself when you finally stop shrinking is the thing that stays with you longer than whatever reaction you get from the room. Renee looked at me differently that night. I noticed. I don't know yet what she'll do with it. My mother said she'd like to understand my work better, and I believe she meant it in that moment. Whether she follows through is her decision. I can't carry that. What I can do is stop making it easy for the wrong version to survive. There's something I think about sometimes. The water treatment facility, the 11 minutes, the call I made that nobody knows about and that I'll probably never be allowed to talk about in detail. The people in that county have no idea. They went on with their day. That's exactly how it's supposed to work. Invisible when it works. I made my peace with that a long time ago. What I hadn't made peace with was letting invisible become the whole story. Not just the nature of the work, but the way my family understood me, the way I let them. You don't fix 6 years in one dinner, but you can decide on a Tuesday night in November on a foggy highway back to the city that you're done building a smaller version of yourself for other people's comfort. That's not a dramatic decision. It doesn't feel like much when you make it. It just feels like setting something down that you've been carrying for a long time without realizing how heavy it had gotten. I took the priority 2 case on Monday. I was good at it. I always had been.